She spent 3 hours curling her hair in front of the mirror, humming a song she had heard on the radio that morning, while checking her reflection from every possible angle to make sure not a single strand was out of place. The apartment smelled like garlic butter and fresh rosemary, a rich and warm aroma that drifted from the kitchen into the small living room, where I sat quietly on a worn-out sofa with a cold cup of tea in my hand. She had wiped down the wooden dining table twice, lighting 3 tall white candles and placing them carefully in the center next to 2 crystal wine glasses that caught the amber glow of the flame. Every movement she made was hurried yet filled with a strange, nervous excitement that made her hands shake slightly as she adjusted the forks and knives for the 100th time. I watched her from the corner of my eye, pretending to turn the pages of the book in my lap, while actually counting every second ticking away on the kitchen wall clock. She wasn't getting ready for me, and she certainly hadn't spent the entire afternoon cooking my favorite meal. She was waiting for a man whose name she had whispered to herself a dozen times while chopping vegetables, a man she had met online 3 weeks ago and talked on the phone until 4 in the morning. I knew how much this dinner meant to her, because she had talked about nothing else for days, buying a new red dress that hung on her wardrobe door, and asking me repeatedly if she looked nice enough for a first real date. But as the clock hand slowly crept past 8 o'clock and then struck 9, without a single knock on the front door, the bubbly excitement in the room started to curdle into a heavy, suffocating silence. She stopped humming, her footsteps slowing down as she walked back and forth from the window to the kitchen, parting the curtains every 2 minutes to look out at the empty street below where streetlights flickered against the damp pavement. I watched the way her shoulders dropped with every passing minute, the bright spark in her eyes dimming into a painful, glassy stare as she realized that the man she had dressed up for wasn't going to show up at all. My own heart gave a strange, complicated twist in my chest because part of me hated seeing her look so utterly heartbroken over a stranger, while another selfish part of me felt a quiet, guilty flicker of relief that she was still sitting right here in this room with me. She finally stopped pacing and stood by the table, staring down at the untouched food and the 2 empty chairs that looked like a cruel joke staged by fate, looking as though her entire world was quietly collapsing under the flickering light of candles meant for someone else. She stood motionless by the dining table for what felt like hours, staring at the empty chair across from her, as if her gaze alone could somehow force the front door to open and make him walk through it. The phone in her hand finally lit up with a harsh, bright flash that cut through the dim candlelight, and she snatched it off the table so fast she nearly knocked over a wine glass. I watched her face drop as she read the message on the screen, her lips parting in disbelief before she pressed her phone tightly against her chest, as if trying to hold together the pieces of whatever hope she had left. Without saying a single word, she walked over to the kitchen counter, set the phone down face down next to the stove, and began blowing out the candles one by one with a slow, shaky breath. The warm, glowing room suddenly felt cold and dark, the smell of burnt wicks replacing the rich aroma of food that neither of us was going to eat, and I hated how helpless I felt sitting just a few feet away from her while she silently fell apart. She sank onto the edge of the chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly as the heavy weight of rejection finally crushed every bit of energy she had left in her body. I wanted to get up and say something comforting, to tell her that she was worth so much more than a guy who couldn't even have the decency to text her back on time, but the words felt stuck in my throat because I knew my own feelings for her were the very secret I had been hiding in this house for months. She looked up slowly, her eyes red and swimming with tears that she was trying desperately not to let fall, and the sight of her broken expression hurt me more than any punch ever could have. I stood up from the sofa, my footsteps loud in the dead silence of the apartment, and walked over to where she sat alone in the darkening room, watching the way she stared down at the floor, as if she wanted nothing more than to disappear completely. I walked closer to the table and reached out my hand, gently pulling the untouched plate away from the empty seat, where another man was supposed to be sitting all evening. She lifted her head slowly, her tear-filled eyes blinking in confusion as she watched me pick up the plate and carry it around the wooden table toward the chair right next to hers. Without a single word, I set the plate down directly in front of me, right beside her own plate, turning the romantic setup for 2 strangers into something much closer and much more honest. The last remaining candle flickered in the center of the table, casting a warm golden light across her face and highlighting the raw surprise and uncertainty written all over her expression. I pulled out the chair and sat down right beside her, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her skin and hear the soft, unsteady sound of her breathing in the quiet room. She looked at the food in front of me and then back up at my face, her lips parting slightly as if she was trying to figure out what game I was playing or if I had finally lost my mind. I picked up my fork and knife, looking straight into her eyes without breaking contact, letting her see every single unspoken truth that I kept locked away behind closed doors for months. I told her that she did not deserve to sit here crying over someone who did not even care enough to show up, and that the only person who should have been sitting at this table with her from the very beginning was me. The tension in the air changed instantly, shifting from heavy heartbreak into a sharp, electric realization that made her catch her breath and stare at me as if she was seeing me for the very first time. She didn't pull away or tell me to move back, and instead she let out a shaky, half-broken laugh through her tears, realizing that while she had spent the whole night waiting for a ghost, the only man who truly cared about her was already sitting right beside her. She reached across the table with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing lightly against my sleeve as she tried to process the sudden shift in the entire atmosphere of the room. The lingering sadness in her eyes slowly melted away, replaced by a deep, overwhelming wave of realization that made her chest rise and fall with every uneven breath she took. We sat there in a heavy silence for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the rain tapping softly against the window glass providing the only background noise to quiet tension filling the space between us. I kept my gaze locked onto hers, refusing to look away, letting her see every single emotion that I had buried deep inside my heart for months while she was busy chasing people who never truly appreciated her worth. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, offering a small, fragile smile that looked both terrified and deeply relieved all at the same time. The food sitting between us was cold now, but neither of us cared about dinner anymore, because the real hunger in the room was for the truth that we had both been too scared to speak aloud for so long. She finally lowered her gaze to the plate in front of me, tracing the edge of the fork with her thumb before looking back up into my eyes with a quiet intensity that sent a warm shiver straight down my spine. I leaned in closer, resting my elbows on the edge of the wooden table, and told her that she never had to cry over anyone ever again as long as I was around to stand by her side through every storm. Her breath hitched in her throat, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something important, but no words came out because the sheer weight of the moment had left her completely speechless. Instead of speaking, she reached out and pulled her chair just a fraction of an inch closer to mine, closing the small physical gap that had kept us separated as mere roommates for all those long and lonely months. The single candle in the center of the table flickered one last time before dying out completely, plunging the room into a dim, intimate shadow where the rest of the world outside simply ceased to exist. I reached over and gently caught her hand in mine, feeling the warmth of her skin against my palm, and as our fingers intertwined in the darkness, I knew that our lives would never be the same again. She gripped my hand back with sudden, firm strength that spoke volumes more than any polished words ever could, her thumb tracing the back of my knuckles as the heavy shadows of the room closed in around us. The lingering echo of the evening's disappointment completely dissolved into the quiet warmth of the kitchen, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of our breathing and the soft patter of rain against the glass outside. We stayed sitting side by side in the dark for a long time. Neither of us wanted to break the spell or ruin the fragile, hard-earned peace we had finally built between our chairs. She leaned her head gently against my shoulder, a soft sigh escaping her lips as the last traces of tension drained from her frame, and I wrapped my free arm around her, pulling her just a little closer against the cold draft. It hit me then that all those months of watching her from afar, pretending to be just a casual roommate, while silently dying inside every time she talked about someone else, had all led up to this exact broken, beautiful moment. She whispered my name into the quiet space between us, her voice barely louder than a breath, asking me why I had stayed silent for so long when she'd been right here all along. I pressed a soft kiss into her hair, answering honestly that I was terrified of losing her friendship if things went wrong. But looking at her now, I knew losing the chance to love her properly would have broken me entirely. A small, genuine laugh escaped her lips, sounding lighter and happier than anything I had heard from her in years, and she turned her face up toward mine in the dim light. The distance between us vanished completely as our lips met in a slow, hesitant kiss that tasted like a fresh beginning after a long, exhausting storm. sealing a promise in the quiet dark that we would never look back at the ghosts of our past again. She pulled back just a fraction of an inch, her eyes searching mine in the dim shadows as a soft, breathless smile touched the corners of her lips. The cold air of the apartment felt entirely distant now, replaced by the heavy, comforting warmth of her hand still tightly intertwined with mine across the wooden table. We did not need to talk about the man who failed to show up, nor did we need to replay the hours of painful waiting that had brought us to this exact turning point in our lives. She reached out with her free hand, her fingertips gently brushing against my cheek before tracing the line of my jaw as if she was memorizing a face she had known for years, yet was seeing for the very first time. The silence around us was no longer heavy or suffocating. Instead, it felt sacred, filled with the unspoken promises of two people who had finally found their way out of the dark. I leaned into her touch, closing my eyes for a brief second to savor the reality of the moment, knowing that every lonely night spent watching her from across the room had ultimately led us here. She stood up slowly from her chair, pulling me gently along with her by the hand, and we walked together out of the kitchen and away from the cold, untouched food that belonged to a past we had both left behind. As we stood by the living room window watching the city lights blur behind the steady sheets of rain falling outside, she leaned her head back against my chest with a quiet sigh of absolute contentment. The world outside kept moving at its usual frantic pace, but inside these four walls, time had completely stopped for us, marking the true beginning of a story where neither of us would ever have to wait alone again. She stood beside me near the tall glass window of the living room, her fingers still loosely intertwined with mine as the rhythmic sound of the pouring rain outside filled the quiet stillness of the apartment with soothing, hypnotic melody that seemed to wash away all the lingering shadows of the past. The city lights below blurred into soft streaks of amber and red against the wet glass panes, casting a gentle, shifting glow across her face and highlighting the quiet relief that had finally smoothed away the tension from her forehead. We did not speak for a long time, because after all the hours of agonizing waiting, sudden heartbreak, and the terrifying honesty that had just passed between us, words felt entirely unnecessary and far too small to capture the massive shift that had just taken place in our lives. I could feel the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest against my arm where she leaned back against me, her presence grounding me in a way that nothing else ever had, turning the small, cramped space of our shared apartment into a sanctuary far away from the chaotic and uncaring world outside. She let out a long, slow breath, a sound that carried away the last remaining traces of the grief she had felt earlier in the evening when the man she thought she wanted had so carelessly brushed her aside without a second thought. I pressed my chin gently against the top of her head, breathing in the faint, sweet scent of lavender and shampoo that always seemed to linger around her whenever she sat close to me on the couch during our late-night movie marathons. Those countless nights of pretending to just be casual roommates, hiding behind polite smiles and casual hallway greetings while my heart broke every time she talked about someone else, flashed through my mind like scenes from a movie of someone else's life. Feeling completely unreal now that her hand was actually resting securely inside my own, she shifted slightly in my arms, turning her head to look up at me with those deep, expressive eyes that haunted my thoughts for months, searching my face as if she was trying to find any remaining doubt or hesitation before letting her guard down entirely. There was no hesitation left in me, only a fierce, overwhelming certainty that whatever came next, whether it was a bright light of morning or another stormy night, we would face it together, side by side, as something infinitely more than the simple title of roommates could ever convey. She reached up with her free hand, her fingertips tracing the edge of my collarbone before resting softly against my chest right over my heart, feeling the steady, racing thud that beat only for her. "You know," she whispered softly, her voice barely carrying over the distant rumble of thunder outside. "For a long time, I thought love was supposed to be this loud, complicated thing that kept you awake at night wondering if you mattered at all to the person standing right in front of you." I looked down at her, my thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, completely captivated by the profound vulnerability in her tone and the way the candlelight from the kitchen cast a golden halo around her hair. "And what do you think it is now?" I asked, my voice barely above a murmur, afraid that speaking any louder might shatter the fragile, beautiful reality we had just built out of the wreckage of a broken evening. A slow, breathtaking smile bloomed across her face, reaching all the way to her eyes and wiping away every trace of the tears she had shed earlier, transforming her expression into something so radiant it completely stole the breath right out of my lungs. "It's this," she answered simply, pressing herself just a little closer against me as if she wanted to melt right into my skin and leave all the cold loneliness of the past behind forever. "It's someone sitting across from you when everyone else has walked away, sliding their plate over to share your quiet, and making you realize that you never had to look anywhere else to find home." Her words settled deep inside my chest like a warm, comforting flame, melting away the last remaining walls of fear that I built around my heart and filling every empty space with profound, unshakable peace. I leaned down, resting my forehead gently against hers, closing my eyes as our breath mingled in the cool air between us, feeling the absolute perfection of a moment where everything in the universe finally felt like it was sitting exactly where it belonged. The rain continued to beat a steady, comforting rhythm against the glass, washing away the dirt of the streets and the bitter disappointment of a failed date, leaving behind a clean slate and a future that felt wide open and entirely ours to write. We stayed standing by that window for hours, watching the city slowly quiet down as the storm passed, and the dark clouds began to break apart to reveal a few scattered, distant stars shining through the clear night sky. Every movement we made was effortless now, stripped of all the awkward hesitation and nervous second-guessing that had defined our friendship for so long, replaced by a quiet, fierce intimacy that only two people who had survived their own private storms could ever truly understand. Eventually, the chill of the late hour began to seep through the glass, and she shivered slightly in my arms, a small, involuntary motion that immediately brought me out of my trance and reminded me of the practical realities of the world waiting for us beyond this room. "Come on," I whispered, pressing one final, lingering kiss to her temple before taking her hand and leading her away from the window and back toward the warm, softly lit hallway that led to our bedrooms. "Let's finally get out of this hallway and get some actual rest. Tomorrow is going to be the first real day of the rest of our lives, and I want to spend every single second of it looking at you." She let out a soft, melodic laugh that echoed down the quiet corridor, her fingers squeezing mine tightly as we walked hand in hand away from the remnants of the cold dinner and the empty promises of a ghost who no longer mattered. As we reached the doorway of her room, she turned to face me one last time before heading inside, her eyes shining with a quiet, fierce devotion that promised me more than any grand romantic gesture ever could in a lifetime. "Good night, Rohan," she said softly, her thumb brushing gently against my palm one last time before she started to step back into her room. "Not good night." I smiled, leaning forward to press a tender, lingering kiss to her lips that tasted like sweet victory and a brand new beginning. "Just see you in the morning, my love." She blushed deeply at the word, a bright, beautiful shade of pink spreading across her cheeks that made her look more alive and radiant than I had ever seen her before, and as she finally slipped inside and closed her door halfway, I stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment listening to her footsteps fade away. I walked slowly back to my own room, stepping inside and closing the door behind me with a light, easy heart, knowing that the agonizing nights of wandering from afar were finally over and that the best part of my story was only just beginning to unfold right here in this quiet apartment.